Good day, everyone. I'm Joel G. Marino Jr. So, for today's discussion, we will be talking about some important matters with regards to different learners in marginalized group, which is the third part of this topic. So, what you see in the picture is an image that depicts thousands of words, a certain feeling which most of us couldn't foretell how it feels. Have you ever felt the feeling of being left behind, deprived, and privileged and treated as less important just because you're not among them? When will the society uses its heart to see the beauty of imperfection, to realize that the world is not fair, but somehow it makes us unfairly equal? How strange, isn't it? Like, how can we define happiness without the presence of sadness? The way we look on things can make a difference. Our point of views can really make a change. Our treatment, our care, our attention and empathy towards those who feel different can somehow change their life ineffably. To help them realize that they are human too, vulnerable but deserved the essence of belongingness. Once again, a pleasant day to each and everyone. By the way, I'll render my part by discussing further details as part of the continuation of this particular topic. So just a quick recap. We've been through the first part, marginalization in education as discussed by Ms. Janbea Garcinas, as well as the second part, marginalization and inclusion as discussed by Miss Cherry Cedillo. So for the third and final part, together with John Philip Salvador, we will impart to you the grasp of our learnings with regards to the different learners in marginalized group. So before we start, let us define first what is marginalization. Marginalization is the process in which something or someone is pushed to the edge of a group and assigned lesser importance. So, in short, it is an individual's feelings of being left out from meaningful participation in a society's processes and activities, even though he or she is a former member of the group. So, one common example of those people who felt being marginalized, particularly in educational environment, are those people who belong to indigenous groups, people with disability, those who have traumatic past experiences, in which we will be tackling about later in this discussion. So, here it is. These are the list or examples of marginalized people or group not just in educational environment but also in other aspects of our society. First, we have child laborer or domestic workers. Second, we have indigenous people. Third, abused children. Fourth, refugees or displaced children. And fifth, children in conflict zones. So first, let us talk about child laborers or domestic workers. Child labor is the practice of having children engaged in economic activity or a part of full-time basis at a very young age, and they are already working. The unfavorable lives that has been given to these children has much more detrimental impacts to their physical and mental development. One of the saddest factors or reasons to be pointed out why these children are forced to work at a very young age is mainly because of poverty, lack of good schools, as well as growth of informal economy. Aside from that, it's the parents' responsibility to sustain for the family, and the children shouldn't be liable for the responsibility that their parents must portray in the first place. One major reason why some children's lives are being compromised is because of the parents' lack of family planning. Actually, this issue is one of our country's major concerns. The rate of teenage pregnancy and unplanned family building can be pointed out why our country is at verge on dealing with poverty. Hence, many lives of our fellow men, especially the young learners, are forced to work to sustain for the family instead of going to school and learn a lot of things for the betterment of their future and for the country. According to the International Labour Organization, child labor affects 215 million minors worldwide. See? How sad to think how immense the population of young laborers, not just in our country but throughout the world. Imagine that 215 million minors or children throughout the globe who are working to sustain for the family instead of going to school. So as a result, they remain illiterate, which limits their ability to contribute to their own well-being as well as to the community they lived. The child labor is where children at their young age choose to work due to poverty. They have no choice but to do it even it is hard because if they will not do it, then they cannot survive from their everyday living. Due to this, they are not able to send in school because the time that they should spend to study was spent to work. There is already law that protects to the right of the child. Included here is the child should not allow to work because it is their parents' responsibility to provide their basic needs. So, what are some of the impacts of child labor on academic performance? First, child labor generates negative effects that hinder the child's cognitive, emotional, and social development. In the majority of cases, child labor makes etiquette, child in youth inclusion, and educational system difficult. So why are these things happening? Because child gives their time for their work and have less or no time to study homeworks. Hence, it would take a long period of time for them to learn since their attention, that supposedly reserved for academic purposes, is reduced due to the fatigue produced by the intense labor. So, what can we do as a person to stop child labor? So, since this issue has been long rooted in our history, there's already a huge gap we need to fulfill. And it's sad to say that it'll take us longer years to address this issue. But for the meantime, our small ways can lead to bigger results and aid for the betterment of our future. We can actually donate funds and NGOs working for rehabilitation of street children as well as strengthening and supporting various advocacy that aims to hinder the increased rate of young laborers and poverty. Second one, we can make the rural people aware or informed about the benefits of education so that these people will be given a chance to rephrase their perspective and somehow realize that their children shouldn't be left behind and therefore must pursue education to cope up with the major changes of our modern world and give contribution not just for the family but for the country as a whole. And for the third, help government to stop child labor. This is a must advocacy that we should support with. As a matter of fact, the government is implementing different avenues with regards to hindering child labor, but the efforts ain't enough unless we as an individual would also participate and offer our deepest empathy towards strengthening such advocacy. So, as a future educator dedicated to serve for our Philippine country, it is our sole duty to motivate and inspire our students, support their needs, as well as to make different strategies and avenues to help peer students learn easily. And aside from that, it's us Filipinos, no matter what professions, race, religion, or political views, let us collaborate our efforts upon building a strong foundation for different avenues and advocacies that aims to hinder the detrimental effects of child labors to our young learners. So moving on to the next part of the list, we have indigenous people. There are children who are part of indigenous group. They are distinct socially and culturally. They are also different from how they live. Thus, they cannot keep pace with modernization. In school, they are sometimes discriminated due to their uniqueness and sometimes they cannot adapt with the school culture. If we will be noticed, there are only few indigenous children who choose to study and interact with the common students due to the differences and discrimination that they experienced. Indigenous peoples generally shares a common sense of identity and common characteristics such as language, religion, tribe, nationality, race, or combination thereof. There are actually 110 indigenous peoples communities numbering between 15 million to 20 million. In Luzon, there were about 30% rate for the population of indigenous people, whereas in Visayas, there are about less than 10% of the population rate as well as in Mindanao, which has roughly about more than 60% population rate for these indigenous people living within the Philippine country. So, what are the harsh encounters that most of our indigenous fellow men experience in the normal classroom setting? So, here are the uh, here are some of the factors or impacts that the indigenous people have encountered or experienced throughout their educational journey. First, school as a venue of discrimination. Second one, prejudice. Third, financial inadequacy. For the fourth one, comprehension difficulties and adjustment difficulties. We can actually observe this particular situation in some reality shows like Maalaala Mo Kaya or MMK. If I'm not mistaken, they featured a college student who's part of the indigenous citizen in our country. In particular, that student was an Aita. His name was Norman King. I believe that you're familiar with him, right? He is an Aita who wants to pursue his profession and somehow impart his learnings to his fellow indigenous men. Along his college journey, he encountered harsh experiences like discriminations, prejudices, and many undesirable things to hear from society's judgment and standards. However, that doesn't stop him to pursue his goal, and eventually, with his great determination, he graduated and fulfilled his dream. What makes his graduation extra special was the fact that he wrote his Katutubo attire at the event, representing his tribe as well as to show to everyone that culture differences can't hinder an individual's right for education and cannot quench an individual's burning desire to achieve goals in life. Well, there's no doubt why Norman King is able to fulfill his goals, because just like us, he's human too. We should stop the stigma, treating indigenous people as less important, uneducated, and such. Though most of them are still uncivilized, we cannot blame them and it's not their fault in the first place. In fact, it is us who are responsible for their absence, and so we must do whatever it takes to lend a helping hand for them to grasp for. Actually, we can help even in small ways, and it does make a difference. By accepting them and treating them just like us can make a better change. It doesn't matter who they are and where they've come from. What matters is their presence. We all exist for a cause, and it's our sole responsibility to help and watch for one another. So now let's talk about on how to address these issues, because since there are those who's been marginalized and need proper attention and care, let's talk about on some things that the government has implemented for them to secure their educational environment. Well, as a matter of fact, there is a law that protects the rights of these indigenous people as stated in Order Number 32 Series 2015. The need for teachers serving in indigenous communities to be adequately oriented and trained so that indigenous cultures are appreciated and indigenous cultural practices and values are not discriminated as backward, inferior, invalid, or primitive. So, as a concluding part of my discussion, child labor and indigenous people both experience discrimination, poverty, and for which has an inadequate access and provisions to education. To conclude, government can help marginalized groups to reach in their positions and help them to live better. And of course, our individual care and actions are highly needed in order to build a strong foundation for different advocacies that aims to secure the rights of marginalized groups to access a healthy educational environment. And that ends my part. For the last three examples of marginalized group, John Philip Salvador, my co-reporter, will render the discussion and impart his learnings for you guys. So this has been Joel Marino, partially leaving things here,